This is level 2 of the CFA program and topic 1, ethical and professional standards, and the reading on guidance for standards 1 through 7. Now the plan is to record 7 videos, one for each of those standards. And if you look here at the list of the standards, I'm guessing that you remember this from your level 1 days. This recording will focus entirely on Standard 1 professionalism, and then we'll move on in subsequent recordings on to each of those other standards. Professionalism, what does that mean? If you look that term up in the dictionary, you get lots and lots of different stuff, but I found a definition that I really like, and I want to read it to you here. So indulge me for just a few seconds here. Professionalism is currently understood as an individual's adherence to a set of standards, a code of conduct, or a collection of qualities that characterize accepted practice within a particular area of activity. And the reason that I like that definition is because of the term inside of it, collection of qualities. And so that's really what we're doing here throughout this Standard 1 professionalism, a collection of qualities. Really, that focus is, all right, what are we doing up here inside of our brains? How are we going to behave in terms of relevance to the law, in terms of relevance to being unbiased, in terms of representing ourselves and our recommendations accurately, and then in terms of our conduct. Now, as a good financial analyst, I'll go ahead and give credit to Queen's University for that definition. So let's look at these learning objectives here. And these are similar to what you've seen back in level 1. But remember, for those of you who've seen the first recording in level 2, you should remember that at level 2, not only are all the topics tested in item set format, but especially in ethics, they're going to be tested at a much more detailed, a much more subtle level. So whatever you remember from your level 1 days, let's use that as a base and let's try to add to it. All right, so we'll demonstrate thorough knowledge, right? Recommend practices and procedures designed to prevent violations. Boy, that's so much more important than trying to resolve a conflict. It's better to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Evaluate practices and policies and conduct, and then see whether or not a particular practice or a policy or behavior does or does not violate part of the code or one of the standards. And in fact, if I were crafting these questions, I would probably craft a question where answer A was no, not a violation. B, yes, a violation for this reason. C, yes, a violation for this reason. Now, of course, you only have 3 choices, but D, yes, a violation for another. E, another. You could put a whole bunch of stuff in there. But so you're going to have to make a determination of A, whether there's a violation or not, and then what is the violation. All right, so let's look at knowledge of the law, part A, pretty quickly here. And this should make perfect sense. I'm guessing that you remember this from level 1. We're focusing up here on our cognitive ability, understand and comply with all of the laws, rules, and regulations. And not just the laws and rules and regulations that are provided by, one particular government, whether it's a federal government or a local government, but it includes all sorts of organizations, both regulatory and licensing and professional organizations, which of course include the CFA Institute Code of Ethics and the standards. But here's the deal, on the exam, you're probably going to be given a set of rules and you're going to be asked to determine whether there was a violation or not. And so I think one shortcut to these answers is to remember that the code and the standard on professionalism requires that members and candidates follow the more strict law, rule, or regulation. Here's the guidance. All right, so understand the laws and regulations in which they work. Comply with the laws. And look what we have in bolded there under that orange bullet point, reasonable and good faith understanding, right? The CFA Institute is not expecting us all to be lawyers. They're not expecting us to be estate planners or tax planners. There's no possible way that we can understand and know and have knowledge of all the laws that are out there, which of course is why we have in-house counsel, we have a compliance officer, we have a compliance department. And if it's just you as an individual in your firm, well, then you hire somebody outside. That's really the way it works, is that, you try to figure it out yourself. And if you can't figure it out, then you ask somebody who's knowledgeable, who's an expert in that area. And then here's one that I like, the blue bullet point, right? You need to make sure that you are constantly aware of the dynamics of politicians and that they can change the laws and change the regulations, pretty much whenever they want. Now, here in the United States, we have at the federal level, we have Congress, and sometimes they act quickly, sometimes they act slowly. And so those changes are probably not too dramatic on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, but certainly on an annual basis. And then the final component of the guidance is to make certain that you're aware of all the requirements for communications. The applicable law is the law that governs the member or the candidate's conduct. And so this is what I was saying just a few moments ago. There might be a conflict. And so look at the exam tip down there in purple. This is what we say. Always select the code and the standards unless the applicable law is stricter than the code and the standards. So that's really going to be the challenge on the exam, to determine which one is more strict. And I think let me just go back here real quick. Look at that first bullet point up there. Understand the laws and regulations of each jurisdiction in which they operate or in which they apply or work. So if you understand those, then you'll be able to determine which law is more strict. Now, of course, during the course of your careers, you're going to run into some type of a scenario under which there's going to be a violation. So what do? So participation in or association with violations by others. All right, so members and candidates only accountable for actions in which they knowingly participate in or assist in, right? And so as soon as you become aware of this violation, then you must dissociate from that activity. And then, of course, in extreme cases, that might involve resignation. All right, so what are those steps? So, of course, you have this compliance department. So you go to the compliance officer and say, hey, this individual or these people over here or that firm there or whoever it is, something's going on. If this is an unethical activity, and sometimes you're not quite sure, is it ethical or is it unethical? It's right on that line. Is it on this side or is it on that side? And that's why you have the compliance department to help you to arrive at that type of a conclusion. And then, of course, you can report it to the CFA Institute's PCP. Now, how about if we take a look at a couple of examples here when the perpetrator is a client and when the perpetrator is the employer. And those of you who watched my recordings back at level 1, I like to give sports examples, but I also like to give entertainment examples. You ever see that great movie, that great Tom Cruise movie, The Firm, where Tom Cruise is a young lawyer and he joins a firm, and this firm has one client, and this one client is engaged in criminal activity, let's say. And so Tom Cruise has a problem. He has a problem with a client. He has a problem with the employer. And the movie's fantastic. It's lots of stress. And so Tom Cruise ends up dissociating with the client. He ends up dissociating with the employer. But at the end, he says he regained his life. So there's what I was thinking. There's professionalism in the end, if Hollywood can do such a thing. All right, so let's go back to the top there when it's a client. So direct discussion with the client, which of course Tom Cruise does at the end of the movie. He meets with those two guys in the hotel room in Memphis. Refusal to continue advising if the client if the discussions fail. So here's a conflict. If the client says, well, no, I like doing this, or I'm not going to stop doing this, and then you have to put your hands up like this and say, all right, let's do something else. So ask for a new assignment. But if it's the employer, then boy, we have to discuss. Of course, we have to discuss. That's the first step. And then you can remove your name from reports or recommendations. And then in an extreme case, you can go ahead and find another job. Look at those final bullet points down, colored bullet points down at the bottom there. The light red one encourages members to report potential violations. And then you can submit those reports to the PCP program. All right, how about as this applies to investment products? All right, so what are we doing here? Inside of our firm, we're going to create these investment products or services, right? I mean, this is financial engineering. This is what we love to do. So what we need to make certain is we know what the laws mean, what the contracts, some of these are contracts, right? If it's a swap contract, it's a legal and binding contract. So we need to make sure that both sides, the buyer and the seller of this contract that we are creating, is aware of all the laws and regulations. And then, of course, we may or may not do this all by ourselves. So if we hire somebody else to help us, then we need to make sure they're aware of all that stuff. So what are recommended procedures here? And this is important for answering exam questions. Stay informed, review procedures, maintain copies, of course. So, part of maintaining copies, that's from the compliance department, and those individuals ought to be able to provide you with those copies whenever you want them, and then seek guidance. All right, for each one of these substandards, we have put together a scenario. So why don't you guys go ahead and pause the video. I won't read this to you, and take as long as you want to read the question stem. Now remember, at the bottom of the page here, all we have is one question here. Tell me about the violation. If it is, then why? But remember, on your level 2 exam, you're going to have this vignette. And so let me go ahead. Can I do this? You're going to have a vignette that has 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs. And then there's going to be 4 or 5 or 6 questions that relate to that paragraph. So you're going to have to read the question and then look up top. Read the question and then look up top. Make sure you don't get vertigo as you're doing this. But as we go through these slide decks for level 2, I'll go ahead and give you some advice on how to handle those vignettes. But go ahead and pause the video, and I'll just take a deep breath, and then I'll continue along with the answer. All right, so here's the solution. Boy, this country has no laws and regulations on insider trading, but this individual still violates it because of knowledge of the law, right? The standard emphasizes that the members and candidates must comply with the stricter rule or the law. In this case, the code is more strict than this particular country. And of course, this individual should be aware of this and comply with the code and ignore those less strict laws from this other country. All right, how about standard 1B, independence and objectivity? This is one that I really like on top of what we just did about knowledge of the law. This one here, knowledge, that is right up here, cognitive ability. So independence and objectivity, what we're doing is we're taking our cognitive skill set up here, and we're going to be mixing it, with what we have down here, our heart, our feelings, and we're going to say, all right, we know our clients, we know our employers, we know our customers, we know the vendors, we know financial markets. So we know all these people, and we're friendly with some, we're acquaintance with others. We don't know these people over there. But what we need to do, independence and objectivity, is we need to make sure that we treat all of those people exactly the same, as if they were our one and only person on the other side of the transaction. All right, so what does this standard tell us? Reasonable care. I love that word, reasonable. It's not unreasonable. We don't have to be perfectly expert, and we don't have to be perfect, right? We're not machines. We're not going to make perfect decisions, but reasonable care and judgment to maintain independence and objectivity in professional activities. All right, so clearly inside of this standard, we need to make certain that we are not influenced by other stuff that's going on while we're performing our duties. The example that I always like to give my students is that let's suppose that I'm some big company here in the United States, and I hire one of you, and you're a financial analyst, and I say, hey, look, we're going to issue a bond, and we want your help. And what we'd like you to do is come visit us, and we'll show you our facilities, and you'll meet all the leadership team, and maybe even some board members are around. And when you come, bring your golf clubs and bring your tennis racket and bring your hunger. We're going to go out to eat. We'll have lobster and steak or whatever it is that you want. We'll go to the country club and play golf, and we'll do all this stuff. So you got to be super, super careful about what to accept and what not to accept. So what does that standard read? Let me do that again. It must not offer, solicit, or accept any gift, benefit, compensation, or consideration that reasonably could be expected to compromise. All right. So of course, if you come to my company and, let's suppose I make crackers or something, and, when you leave, I say, here, boy, we're just trying out these new crackers. Here's a box of crackers. I mean, that sounds like something that is a modest gift. But remember, it's your responsibility to determine what is the level of modesty. For example, let me take an extreme one. Let's just suppose for some reason that when you come visit my company and my city, that the Summer Olympics are going on, and I say, hey, here's a ticket or 2 tickets to the soccer finals or whatever it is. Here it is. Boy, you're looking at those, and let's suppose you're a big soccer fan, and you're saying, oh, should I take these? Yeah, you can take them, but just pay for them. So it's it's your responsibility to distinguish what is a modest gift. And if there's ever any kind of a doubt, just go ahead and pay for it yourself and say, you know what, I'm not comfortable receiving this, but I'm happy to pay for it. How about buy side versus sell side and public companies here? All right. So we've got a potential conflict of interest here. So you have some people inside of the firm who are saying things like, boy, I really would like to take, let's just go back to my company, Jim's company. Boy, I really would like to recommend and have all of our clients over here buy stock and bonds in Jim's company. And then you're over here doing research on me, and you came to my company and you visited, and you said, well, you know what, I'm not so sure about the efficiency in their operations. I'm not sure about the compensation arrangements. I'm not sure about agency conflicts. I looked at their cash flow statement, and boy, it doesn't really look exactly like my cash flow estimates. All right, so you got this potential conflict. And so you need to be aware of that. So look at that third bullet point there. Portfolio managers should refrain from putting undue pressure on sell-side research analysts. Sell-side analysts must maintain their independence. All right, that makes perfect sense. All right. Let's see, the third part of this, third-party custodians. Of course, we'll talk at length about third-party risk, sometime in the future, but, whatever applies to us inside of our firm, that has to apply to third party as well. How about the fourth component here, performance measurement and attribution? I'm a huge fan of that whole process of looking at an attribution analysis, whether it was security selection or whether it was asset allocation that drove performance. So I'm a huge fan of that kind of analysis, but we need to be careful of how we present this and how we measure this so it doesn't make us look a little bit better than what we are. So what are we doing here? Maintaining independence and objectivity. Of course, that's the standard, and that makes perfect sense. When hiring investment managers, of course, we're not accepting tickets to the Olympics, et cetera, et cetera. Here we go. This is another good one. If a member or a candidate is hired as an independent analyst, and this is fine, right? So, of course, this is what we do for a living, right? So if you're hired as an independent analyst, You must perform thorough and unbiased analysis, and you must disclose the nature of the composition of the compensation. And so, here's the deal. You don't want to say in your employment or your independent contractor contract, you don't want to say something like, oh, yes, if I make this much money, then I should get 10% of that. Or if you make this much money, I should get 10% of that. So look at the second teardrop point. Strictly limit their compensation to a flat fee, which means, and look at the third teardrop point, which means that none of that flat fee should be tied to stock warrants or company equity, because that's going to influence you, and you may be tempted to write a report that's not based on your fundamental analysis. Travel funding. All right, so I mentioned this just a little bit ago. Suppose the company, my company, right, Jim's company. Suppose I say to you, look, I don't want you to have to get in a taxi. I don't want you to have to go to the airport. How big is your street out in your front yard? How about if I land my helicopter in your backyard or in your front yard, and I'll pick you up and bring you over here? You gotta put the limits on some of those things. All right, so accepting paid travel, privately chartered flights, and all right, may appear to influence. All right, so to avoid the appearance of compromised independence, cover all necessary travel expenses. So this is really a good conversation to have with your employer. You could say, all right, hey, Jim has offered to pick me up in his helicopter in his front yard. I'll go ahead and pay for it. It's going to cost $27,000 or some number, right? All right, so here are the recommended procedures. All right, protect the integrity of the opinion, right? I mean, this is what we're doing here. We are studying level 1, level 2, and level 3 topics so that we can become experts. And we're going to gather all this information on a particular security or a particular financial asset or whatever it is. And then our opinion is going to be of great value to somebody else, right? So our opinion is extremely important. And then what we need to make sure is that layered on top of our opinion is that big word that begins with an I. Boy, what did we say this about the code? Integrity, right? So we layer our opinion with integrity that says, hey, look, I did a lot of hard work. I know that my opinion is based on all these facts. Now I have an opinion, so maybe I have a strong opinion, and this is based on my experience and my skill set, et cetera, et cetera. But hey, look, here's my opinion. Anybody else can come in and do the same thing, and I'm willing to bet that they come up with some kind of similar conclusions. All right, restricted lists and special cost arrangements. I mean, these make perfect sense. Limit gifts, restrict investments, review procedures. I like this diamond point there at the bottom. Encourage firms to set up supervisory and review procedures, because look, we know that we live in a dynamic environment, we live in a dynamic economy, and we live in a dynamic regulatory scanned environment. So we need to make certain that we're up on top of all of these things. So review procedures continuously. How about the firm having a formal policy on independence and objectivity, right? Formal policy, which says something like, look, I can go to these pages inside of the policy and I can read, here's the do's and here are the don'ts. Go ahead and pause the video once again and go ahead and read this at your own pace. And I'll just keep going and skip over to the answer. So notice the question in purple at the bottom, has this individual violated our standard 1B, independence and objectivity? All right, so this individual really has two options in this case. One, which I liked immediately when I read the question stem, this was immediately popped into my head. Instruct her boss that she is not going to cover the company under these constraints, right? The constraint, all right, here's this big constraint over top of this individual. But then I thought, as I went through this and read it a second time, I thought, oh, wait a minute, if I'm this individual, I've been given an assignment, I'm gonna go and do this assignment. And then we'll see what happens at the end, right? If I agree with what my boss says, then it's probably okay. If I disagree, then I probably have to have a conversation, right? So what is one of those previous slides? I don't want to go back to it now. Boy, reasonable care. There's that word reasonable. What's reasonable? And it's reasonable to do your work, right? And if you agree, that should be reasonable. If you disagree, then it's reasonable to have a conversation. And then if that conversation with the boss doesn't go very well, then you have other people to talk to about. Let's look at the guidance down there. Misrepresentation includes omission of facts. Oh my gosh, boy, this is really tempting to list, all this stuff and forget about the one thing that you might not want people to read. Making false or misleading statements, that's no good. Guarantee returns. And look what we put in parentheses there, U.S. Treasury. So you can say something like this. You can say, hey, if we invest in Treasury securities and we hold them to maturity and the yield is 5%, then you'll earn 5%, right? That's not any kind of violation of a misrepresentation, because U.S. Treasury securities are considered to be default risk-free if you hold them to maturity. But let's be careful. This is a great sneaky exam question. Be careful. Treasury securities, they might not have any default risk, but they sure have interest rate risk. So price of those Treasury notes and Treasury bonds could fall. So make sure you catch that on an exam. Differentiate between default risk, that guarantee of returns, you've got to hold them to maturity, and interest rate risk. And then, of course, plagiarism. Let me just refer back to my definition of professionalism. I mean, I got that online somewhere, and but I wanted to adhere to this standard, and so I gave you the source of it. And I tell my students this all the time. Look, there's lots of really smart people out there that have done lots of work, and if you find it somewhere and you want to use it as part of a document, it's okay to use it. Just tell me. Just tell me where you got it and who it was. And I also say this to students as well. Convince me that this is a good source. If I'm Jim and I write something online and I say, oh, hey, this is how you cut your grass, and I never cut my grass before, and you copy and paste and you put it in a report, and someone's going to be scratching their head saying, boy, you relied on Jim. He's never sat on a lawnmower or pushed a lawnmower in his life. So make sure when you cite it that it's a reliable source. Yeah, members and candidates should not misrepresent their academic qualifications. All right, this goes back to integrity, right? So back on the code, integrity. I love that word, integrity. Personal or firm performance history. How about I give you another entertainment example? Do you remember in Seinfeld when George Costanza got a job because he put risk management as one of his qualifications? And George said to Jerry, it may have been on my resume. He, of course, doesn't know anything about risk management. So don't be like George Costanza. Of course, exercising care when using third-party information. Boy, there's this whole specter of third-party risk out there that has elements under, financial risk stuff, but it also has elements of misrepresentation. So let's just make sure we're careful of that. Use appropriate benchmarks to evaluate performance. Sometimes this is super easy. If we're an index fund manager, that's super easy to come up with a benchmark. But I always try to convince my students that, look, if you're managing a portfolio for a client and you have selected, let's say, 40 different assets, some stocks, some bonds, some alternative assets, what kind of a benchmark do you use? And I say, well, go out and create your own benchmark. Look at your 40 assets and say, okay, let me find 40 other assets that are not in my portfolio that have similar risk, and there's my benchmark. Now, of course, I do this, at the theoretical level for my students because they're not going to be able to go out and do that in an academic exercise. But of course, it's certainly appropriate to come up with your own benchmark. Provide reliable and accurate pricing to clients. All right, that makes sense. Social media, boy, this is just so risky here. Distribute the same information to all current and potential clients. Communication that is released through social media comply with the codes and standards. Oh boy. I'm not a big social media dude, but I read about this all the time. People making posts and getting in trouble. Just make sure that you're super careful in all of this. But I think that the beginning of this standard was that the CFA Institute was concerned that you would have certain clients inside of one social media platform, and you might provide them with information before you provided that to your other clients. So make certain that you don't do that. So that's why that first diamond point tells us same information to all current and potential clients. How about models? Boy, we're going to learn about so many models. What model? If I said to you, go like this, and what's one model that you remember from level 1? Hopefully you would say something like capital asset pricing model. All right, so you've got input. So avoid knowingly omitting inputs that could mislead users of the models. One of these early readings inside of level 2, we're going to do some quantitative analysis. Boy, we have all different sorts of models in there. So we want to make sure that when we craft a model that we decide, which are the relevant inputs and which are the irrelevant inputs. And then, of course, we need to make certain that whoever's reading our report knows all the work that we did, right? Hey, I worked really, really hard, but here's some fundamental support for why I included these inputs. Never state the conclusions from the model as fact. That's a super important statement because that lends itself just so clearly to be an answer on an exam that sounds like the correct answer. It sounds just like the correct answer, but make certain that you avoid that mistake. Here we go, plagiarism. I just talked about this just a few moments ago. Without acknowledging the source. All right, so examples here. These are great exam questions. Taking credit for a research report that has been written by another analyst. Boy, that sounds exactly like plagiarism, right? Copying excerpts without acknowledging, using graphs without acknowledging, proprietary models without acknowledging, or seeking permission, right? So I tell my students that you get this stuff online and there's a model out there, and a lot of students like to go out and find Excel models, like whether it's optimization or whether it's, how to price credit default swap or, whatever it is. And if so, there's a model out there. Of course, if they get it online, they just have to cite it. But, sometimes there are going to be models out there that are proprietary, and you're going to find those regularly. So make sure you ask permission. How about this? The following quote is attributed to a leading expert, a financial guru. Avoid those kind of things, right? Just find somebody, say this person over there, whoever it is. All right, recommended procedures for compliance here. So factual presentation, this makes perfect sense. A qualification summary, verify, right? Accuracy of third-party providers. Update all web pages and social media outlets, and then look at that last triangle point down there. Develop a plagiarism policy, much like we talked about earlier with other kinds of policies. If it's written out, this is why you have a compliance department. Have them write it out, and so that we can always consult it when there is an issue. Once again, go ahead and pause, and I'll go ahead right to the answer after I take a deep breath. Notice the question there: have we violated this standard here? I think this is just a typo, right? So here we go. Ready? Misrepresentation involves knowingly making the error. So here's a typo, and of course we're all subject to typos, some more so than others. That's why whenever I put something out, I always try to go back and read it a second time. It's always helpful to have a colleague read something and say, hey, find my mistakes. And then, of course, somebody's going to find your mistake. It's already published. Then you need to make sure that you take the necessary and, are you ready for this? The reasonable steps to correct it and to inform all of those who have the inaccurate information. Think of this as the correction section of the Wall Street Journal. I like reading it just to see exactly what kind of corrections Wall Street Journal editors feel like they are compelled to make. I mean, some of them are, really, really straightforward, like one word. But Wall Street Journal is really strict on correcting their mistakes. All right, how about the final one? Misconduct. Any professional conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit. There are some, yeah. Oh my gosh, look at this. Reputation, integrity again. All right, so guidance here. Dishonest conduct, lying, cheating, stealing, or any unethical behavior. Must not compromise reputation, integrity, or competence. And because, really, what's the deal? What that does, of course, not only does it hurt the individual who's committing the lying or the cheating or the stealing, not only does it hurt that individual, but it reflects poorly on the rest of us who hold the designation, and then on the larger investment community, and then on society as a whole, right? Oh, let me go back here. What is that? Consuming alcohol during working hours. Yeah, that's an obvious notion there. All right, recommended procedures, develop a code of ethics, list of potential violations, conducting background checks on each potential employee to establish their character. All right, here's a really short example. We probably don't need to pause the video here. Here's an avid activist, and she was arrested at a peaceful protest. She is accused of creating a public disruption. So is this misconduct? Boy, probably not, right? Let's just talk about this in a reasonable sense. Does this reflect poorly on her reputation, integrity, or competence? Probably not. Of course, we're allowed to participate in causes that we feel compelled to, that we are passionate about. And of course, we have the right to gather. We have the right to say something like, hey, we think this is wrong, and we're here to voice our opinion. And, as long as we're doing this peacefully, then I think it's okay. Here's our LOS recap. I think we've done these, right? Demonstrate thorough knowledge, right? Recommend, evaluate, explain, do not, or does violate. And so as you're reviewing these LOSs, go back and remind yourself that this professionalism, right, is part of the code of ethics, right? We have the code, which is, the big pictures, the big picture thing about describing acceptable behavior, and then the standard of professionalism inside of that code.